Oluwafemi Samuel Adelabu is a Global Excellence in Stature 4.0 Post-Doctoral Research Fellow in the Department of Industrial Design at the Faculty of Art, Design and Architecture at the University of Johannesburg. He has an industrial design background with a specialization in ceramics from the Federal University of Technology in Akure in Nigeria. In 2015, he obtained a doctoral degree in Affective Design Science at the University of Tsukuba in Japan through the Japanese government MEXT scholarship. His areas of research broadly cover the cross-cultural evaluation of aesthetic value perception and preference in product designs, development of functional ceramic products using locally available materials, exploration of CAD tools for ceramic prototyping and production processes, and evaluation of design education curricula and pedagogy. He currently investigates issues on design education curricula in the 4IR with a specialist focus on BRICS nations. He is a young, motivated scholar whose passion is to challenge the status quo, break the frontier of innovative research for sustainable development, and evolve African culture-inspired designs for contemporary and emotion-rich expressions. He has co-authored over 25 articles in reputable journals and holds a lecturing position in the Department of Industrial Design at the Federal University of Technology, Akure, Nigeria, since 2009. So today, Samuel is going to present to us on design education and 4IR imperatives, and I will leave it up to him to continue with this presentation, and I hope you all enjoy it.
Yeah, thank you, everyone, for joining. In contrast to the early industrial revolutions, the fourth industrial revolution is based not on a single technology, but on a confluence of multiple development and disruptive technologies. In its scale, scope, and complexity, the transformation will be unlike any other revolutions that we've experienced. This technological revolution will fundamentally alter the way we live, work, and relate to one another. I would like to note that at the Faculty of Art, Design and Architecture at the University of Johannesburg, the question of the fourth industrial revolution raises a series of questions and provocations rather than suggesting a simplistic approach. Now, this presentation formed part of a series of robust conversation on the role of the 4IR, both at the institutional level and, of course, at the national level. We are actively finding ways of allowing ourselves to question our programs and our curriculum design, particularly in relation to multi and interdisciplinary nature. It is evident that there is a need to consider the crucial role of maintaining a social justice, human-focused approach to understanding and engaging with the challenges of the fourth industrial revolution. My name is Oluwafemi Samuel Adelabu. I'll be presenting on a seminar topic, Design Education and the 4IR Imperatives, a preliminary evaluation of the South African industrial design curricula in the era of 4IR. Yeah. So as design at its root is, as we know, it cannot be separated from human development. Even from time immemorial, tool making was key to human survival and progress. Now, with the first industrial revolution springing up around 1760, design began to play a prominent role in the development and marketing of the outcome of mechanized production. Now, with the changing phase of human technological progress, which has today culminated in the fourth industrial revolution, the higher education role holds a great potentiality in positioning human for the expectations of the society. The fourth industrial revolution is a new era in human development driven by rapid technological progress, and it represents a fundamental change in the way we live, work, and relate to one another. Although there are various frameworks that have been proposed, a recurrent theme focuses on the convergence of technologies based on the fusion of the physical, digital, and the biological space. Now, today, unlike the previous revolution, the 4IR represents a period of an integration of multiple technologies and developments, which are fast evolving and at an exponential rate. South Africa has taken the fourth industrial revolution as a new frontier for future development. And the South African institutions have been charged to develop content to meet the needs of learners for the new era. This presentation is thus focused on a study that explored the curriculum of industrial design program offered in the BRICS nation with a special focus on South Africa. Now, as we know, industrial design is a creative discipline which sees the world, which sees problem as opportunities for design outcomes. Unlike, like other fields of human endeavors, design is influenced by the philosophy of human-centered design. Industrial design rather. It drives innovative solution through a combination of practical ideas, technology, and scientific processes. The design outcome includes physical artifacts, which delivers on business goals, which are manufacturable and user-friendly. But as the world continues to experience rapid and unprecedented changes, quality education, which leads to meaningful learning outcome, is required to drive sustainable development. And given that design is actually a tool for driving socioeconomic development and also for confronting some real challenges in our world today, the need to redefine the design education curricular framework becomes more obvious. Also, the imperative for higher learning transformation for the fourth industrial revolution must also be considered. So today, there is a growing need to rethink the future of design education. And this had been seen in some recent forums of design educators. For instance, we have the Design Educators Forum of Southern Africa's meeting conference last year. And we have Globally with Design conference that took place at the University of Johannesburg last December. And also we have the EVE conference, EVE Design Education Conference, that emphasized on the need to rethink the future of design education. Hence, this study or this talk will actually expound and would attempt to open our mind towards the effort that are required, especially to realigning the learning expectation for the 21st century and for the emerging workplaces. Now, when we talk about the digital revolution, many governments around the world have recognized the potential impact of the digital revolution. Especially, for instance, in 2011, Germany advanced the vision of its smart manufacturing system called Industry 4.0. Likewise, in the same year, the US established its initiative of the Advanced Manufacturing Partnership to revitalize the American manufacturing sector through investment in emerging technologies and skills. In 2016, Japan proposed human-centered blueprint for the future society, and they called it Society 5.0. In 2019, the South African government took action by setting up a presidential commission on the fourth industrial revolution to drive its 4IR program using an integrated approach. Now, considering the array of problems facing the African continent, it is believed that Africa can leverage from the new technological waves, especially for industrialization and empowerment of its fast-growing youth population. Of course, there has to be a consideration for sustainable digital development. And for this to happen, Africa will require the right mix of solutions. and an appropriate response towards embracing the rapidly growing technologies and managing the opportunity for an inclusive, equitable, and just society. And just as supported by the Agenda 2063 proposed by the African Union, African Master Plan for a people-centered transformation must be anchored on its need for inclusive and sustainable economies. Now, when we talk about the competencies for the 21st century learning, now, I'll first like to define what competency mean according to the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. Competency is the ability to meet complex demands by drawing and mobilizing psychosocial resources, including knowledge, skills, value, attitude in a particular context. So based on the ongoing global debate about the role and purpose of higher education in the modern world, there are two prevailing viewpoints which will serve as a guide for this, of course, for this discussion. On one hand, the universities are believed to exist to provide future society with the requisite skill-based, and of course, and also for them to contribute to the improvement of intellectual and moral values of the society. Educators and curriculum specialists today are increasingly tasked to gain an in-depth understanding of the learner's current and future context, and also, of course, to identify and infuse relevant context in the curricula. This demands the infusion of the 21st century skills such as innovation, creativity, problem-solving skills, critical thinking, communication, collaboration, self-management, and the host of others. For instance, the Committee on Defining Deeper Learning for the 21st century skills emphasized that the 21st century skills are important dimension of human competence and key to preparing young people for future career success. Now, just as shown in the slide, we can see the P21 framework that was proposed by the Partnership for 21st Century Skills. And now, generally, the nature of educational curricula can be described in two ways. Number one, a subject-based curriculum, and number two, a competence-based curriculum. Now, for a subject-based curriculum, it's designed to prepare the learners to gain a deep understanding of a subject matter. But however, it does not emphasize the immediate relevance and use of acquired knowledge. Now, on the other hand, a competence-based curriculum provides relevant knowledge to learners that is rooted in the understanding of the demands of the learner's context, which could be complex and multidimensional and also diverse in nature. Now, according to Marope, Griffin, and Kalaga, 2017, a three-paneled framework for global reference on future competencies that depicts within its first panel the interrelationship between the constituent element of competence, which include information, data, technology, knowledge, skills, value, attitude, to interactively produce within the second panel 7 macro competence, which are considered relevance across context. These macro competence includes lifelong learning, self-agency, interactively using diverse tools and resources, interacting with others, interacting with the world, multiliteracy, and transdisciplinarity. Now, in the third panel, the framework describes the impact of all these occurring inputs and certain competencies towards the good of individual, collective, and the public. Now, I would also consider this within the framework of sustainable, of educational framework for sustainability transformation. And according to the framework proposed by Kopi, Volis, and 2019, promoting the right knowledge and access to quality education will definitely prepare the society to forge a sustainable path towards embracing the potential future promises of the new technological era. So as the gain of the 4IR are much desired for an unequal society, leveraging exponential technology for the fulfillment of human needs in a more sustainable way will actually require reorienting the curricular framework to act as a driver for balancing the social, technical, and ecological system. Now, as the demand for skill related to social and environmental responsibility is increasing in the workplace, the education for sustainability is seen as a path to enable students develop a range of skills, such as critical thinking, problem-solving skills, and the ability to evaluate and assess material. So, according to this framework, a participatory approach is being drawn, and this framework actually shows a five-step component, which include one, a participatory vision of sustainability, such as the United Nations Development Goal. Number two, enabling conditions for sustainability. And number three, competence for sustainability transformation. Number four, pedagogies and learning and learning strategy for education for sustainable development. And number five, monitoring and evaluation of education for sustainable development competence, and distance from sustainable state. So just like we can see in this slide. Now, the research questions raised by this study is shown, and I'll quickly run through. As far as it's known, not much has been done so far, especially to probe into the curricular structure of industrial design education and the implication of the current technological trend, especially within the context of the BRICS countries or BRICS nations within the Global South. Now, such study must be undertaken because curriculum itself, it shapes the learning experience of students, and it also forms the building block of courses that are considered relevant to student training. So with no exception for industrial design education, there is a growing need to revisit the underlying structure for the program for the industrial design program towards enhancing the institutional capacity to deliver graduates that can rise to the work demand of the 21st century. So we raise these core questions for this study in line with this. What are the prominent attributes of the industrial design and education in the BRICS country around the Global South? And what are the curricular framework of industrial design, higher education in the 4IR era from a sustainable design standpoint? And what are the right set of 21st century competencies, like the core knowledge, skills, value, and attitude expected of industrial design students in the 4IR era? And what are the arising implications of the 4IR on graduate employability and career development? Now, I would just briefly like to talk about the BRICS nation. The BRICS nation or country consists of Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and these countries are noted for their newly advanced economic developments, and they are among the fastest growing economies in the world. So while commendable efforts are being put into place by the developed countries towards the development of youth, towards meeting the work needs of the 4IR era, the developing economy too must take a proper step and proper position to minimize the potential risk and maximize the opportunity of the fourth industrial revolution era. So since dissemination of 4IR appears to be a very high priority for the BRICS countries, just as noted by Bond 2018, a fast leap towards meeting the challenges of the 4IR era by rethinking higher education curricula is very, very important and should be explored. So I'd like to talk about the 4IR and also the South African imperatives. So today, the 4IR has become a global phenomenon associated with a remarkable shift in manufacturing and production technology, just as we're saying. It had been described as a result of an integration of the compounding effect of technologies such as artificial intelligence, biotechnologies, nanomaterials, and so on. Now, South Africa has started to deliberately align itself with the realities and expectations of this new era, which is believed that, it is believed that most of the works that exist today may not exist in the future. And so the initiative to integrate the 4IR better into the South African society have been manifested through local initiative for the 4IR. For instance, the Presidential Commission on 4IR, the agenda for the 4IR in South Africa, and then the ministerial theme on the 4IR in post-school education and training. And I like to note that, of course, the Vice Chancellor of the University of Johannesburg, Professor Mawala, is actually a key person in this in the progress of this new initiative. Now, today we know that as this new technology are evolving, and definitely we can see the impact on design education, although this impact is not yet widespread, but we actually can see examples of these technologies being adopted already for design learning and training. For instance, we have the 3D printing. And of course, we have a lot of these technologies that are being termed as destructive because of the way that they are growing and impacting work and lives of people. I would just like to quickly give an example. For instance, I attended a workshop in a conference just last week. It's called the Product Design and Engineering Conference at Henning in Denmark. It was held virtually, and there was a workshop on introduction to emerging sketching technology. And in this workshop, we're introduced to new tools that can be used for sketching, and these are based on virtual realities. These are based on virtual realities technology and augmented realities. So, of course, we also had a workshop on 3D printing, which I was part of at the Industrial Design Department during the 2019 Conference of Visual Communication Design. And of course, this also actually showcased the potential of 3D printing for design education. Likewise, at the Industrial Design Department at the University of Johannesburg, student projects have been centered around smart technologies and biomaterials and smart materials, and a lot of these things are based on the technologies of the fourth industrial revolution era technologies. Now, for this study, or for this talk, I would like to focus on some data that we've gathered, especially on the industrial design curricula in South Africa. And of course, we raised some questions for this study, and I would like to just quickly share some of the results that we got from this. So now, we focused on identifying or deconstructing the prominent attributes of industrial design education in South Africa. And then we asked the question of the basic, we questioned the basic component of the industrial design curricula in South Africa, higher education, and then the likely implication for curricular development in the fourth industrial revolution era. Now, I would like to talk about the context for this study, which is quite important. South Africa is a country in the southernmost part of Africa, of course, and a middle-income emerging market with a population of about 57 million. And it has a well-developed financial, legal, communication, energy, and transport sectors. However, there are challenges which include unemployment, poverty, inequality, among others. Now, as at 2016, South Africa has 26 public universities with 94 registered and 31 provisionally registered private higher education providers. Similarly to other sectors in South African society, development of an inclusive higher education system has been significantly affected by racial segregation. However, with the abolition of apartheid rule in 1994, government policy in South Africa were reviewed to align with the expectation of the new dispensation. And in this democratic dispensation, the nation is still faced with huge challenges, though, primarily the need to achieve greater efficiency, equity, and effectiveness within this institution and across the system. Now, I'll quickly like to point out the method we adopted for the study. We took an exploratory approach to understand the curricular structure of industrial design program. And then we did a review of relevant literature on the development of industrial design education in South Africa and the 4IR imperatives. So we collected data from curricular data from 4 institutions offering industrial design program from publicly available sources. And these were approved by the South African Qualification Authority, SAQA. Now, the data was thematically analyzed using a qualitative data analysis software called COCOS. Now, I would like to quickly discuss about our key findings. We have 4 institutions offering industrial design, 3 public higher institutions and 1 private higher institutions. I would like to note that 3 of these institutions are located in 1 province, while the other one is located in another province. So we have 2. We have all the institutions located in 2 out of 9 provinces in South Africa. Now, the pioneering tertiary program in industrial design in South Africa was introduced in 1963 at the School of Art in Johannesburg, which later became the University of Johannesburg in 2005. Other 3 programs were later established, which include the Cape Technikon, now called the Cape Peninsula University of Technology, CPUT, and then at the Tshwane University of Technology, TUT, in 2008, and later on in 2011 at the Open Window University. At the onset, the model for industrial design in South Africa was patterned after the British industrial heart model. A man named Botha, a product of the UK design education system around the 1950s, actually pioneered the program. And due to the segregation in South Africa under the apartheid regime, the early design students were trained were mainly white men, and the curriculum were dominated by the Eurocentric view and approaches to design. Particularly, their training was underpinned with the philosophy of good design promoted by the Council of Industrial Design in the UK from 1944. Now, following the abolishment of the apartheid system in 1994, South African industrial design program began to redirect their focus to suit the design needs of the local context and slowly embracing the need and the diversity of the South African society. Now, I would like to discuss the prominent attributes of the industrial design higher education in South Africa. Now, from the data which we subjected to qualitative analysis, a pattern of 3 layers of interconnected overarching themes was established around the core of industrial design education in South Africa. The 3 layers were found to be predominantly rooted in the notion of appropriate knowledges and were guided to produce results for relevant and context-based outcomes. The themes at the inner layer or the foundation stage indicate a pattern of learning which strives to expose the student to fundamentals of design, covering basic design philosophy, design knowledge, skills, competency building, and exploration of material tools and technology. Following this is the mid layer or the intermediate stage, which advances students into design practices guided by research literacy or academic literacy, exploration of the design processes, and design for outcomes. Now, for the outer layer, this builds on the former with a level of awareness for social, economic, and environmental considerations. From the inside out, this model tends to suggest a curricular landscape where a formative evaluation of student learning is employed at the beginning and shifted progressively to a summative evaluation approach towards the end. So overall, the dominant underlying element of appropriate knowledge application for context-based and relevant design outcome emphasize the notion of building critical citizenship through design education in South Africa. So we infer that the industrial design curriculum or curricula across the school show an integration of research-led design practice, fostered by appropriate design knowledges, competencies, and skills for development of design solution with social, technical, economic, and environmental considerations. So what are the drivers for the curricular development? Now, the thematic analysis reveal socioeconomic, technological, and ecological consideration components as key drivers of the existing curriculum, although at varying levels. Emphasis is placed on the need to consider appropriate technological application in solving design problems with an understanding for global market systems and cultures. And there's also consideration for ecological sustainability in the design process, which was actually relatively low across the body of curricular text. So what are the curricular expectations for the 4IR era? So the industrial design education is, of course, shaped by the way it is determined by the way it is taught, which will determine whether the designers being trained are capable of dealing with the complexity of design problems. So training emerging designer with capability to deal with the complexity of design problem, there's a demand, there's now a demand of the future workplace. There is a demand of the future workplace and the emerging manufacturing system, which is required, of course, which necessitate the need to train the emerging designers. Now, the assimilation within the higher education curricular framework must go beyond its technological and economic aspect to also consider the social, cultural, and ecological relevance. So while the 4IR proposes a future filled with possibilities and opportunities, its assimilation within the higher education curricular framework must go beyond its technological and economic aspect. But this must also consider the social, cultural, and ecological relevance. So while the vision of developing a critical citizenship design education is reflected in the current curricula, the untapped potential for achieving an optimal learning outcome must also be developed further. We also observe that the integration of essential lifelong learning skills would be necessary to enable learners to rise dynamically to the challenges of the fourth industrial revolution era in creating multiple and sustainable design outcomes. So I would like to give a concluding remark. Now, studies are on the way to engage with relevant stakeholders in order to uncover the unwritten layer of the industrial design curriculum. Especially, we found that there will be a need to consider the integration of essential lifelong learning skills that will enable learners to actually face the demand of this current era. And some of these skills include the human skills that we refer to as the four C's of the 21st century skills. Now, this study had laid a groundwork for future studies and also provided useful hints for understanding the current curricular structure in view of positioning the curriculum for the 4IR era. Of course, we have used a publicly available data, and we hope to explore further on the content and concept of industrial design curricula in South Africa. So hopefully, with what we've achieved so far, we believe that the drive for the new skill development and integration in South African higher education and beyond, there will be a need to question our current curricular model with a view to providing the upcoming designers or design students with the right set of tools, knowledges, and values for maintaining a systemic balance in the social, technical, and ecological system. So I would like to end my presentation on this note. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Samuel. That was a wonderful presentation. As I said at the beginning, I think what we'll do now is just move over to the next presentation. And so if those of you that are participating can just note down any questions that you have. Samuel, if you can just stop your screen share, and then Annelie will have your presentation go up now. And while Annelie is busy setting her presentation up, I'll give a bit of an overview in terms of her background. So Annelie Bowie is currently a postdoctoral research fellow in the University of Johannesburg's Visual Identities in Art and Design Research Center, or VIAD. Before joining VIAD, she worked as a lecturer, research supervisor, and academic coordinator in information design and visual culture studies at the School of Arts at the University of Pretoria. Annelie obtained a PhD in information design in 2018 with a thesis titled Reframing Design Trends, a Burkean meta-rhetorical approach. While completing her PhD, she spent 2 years in an Erasmus Mundus exchange at Uppsala University in Sweden. And as a visiting scholar in Uppsala's Literature and Rhetoric department, her research interests were broadened beyond examining visual design products towards analyzing verbal argumentation about design products and processes. While her thesis focused primarily on applying the ideas of rhetorician and critic Kenneth Burke to understanding design arguments, her ongoing research focuses on rhetorical aspects of communication design and popular culture more broadly. In the current project, she examines the verbal and visual rhetorics surrounding the so-called Fourth Industrial Revolution, specifically as it features on the South African agenda. Annelie is currently serving as guest editor for the special edition on visual rhetoric and rhetorics of the visual for the South African journal Image and Text, and she's also a member of the Global Rhetorics podcast. And she's going to be presenting in this DESIS seminar on reframing the Fourth Industrial Revolution. So, Annelie, I'm going to hand over to you.
All right, thank you, Angus. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Angus did a good job of introducing me, so I won't say anything more. I will say that my angle on the Fourth Industrial Revolution is quite different from what Samuel just presented, coming from a more visual studies kind of perspective, as well as looking at more philosophical debates and rhetorical perspectives on the issue. So yeah, I think they go well together in the sense that Samuel speaks a lot about appropriate knowledge for the design curriculum, and I think that the rhetorical aspects that I have in mind are absolutely vital in developing those kinds of appropriate responses to our current situation. I feel a little bit uncomfortable with my video on the whole time, so if that's okay, I'm going to stop my video. Angus, maybe you can just let me know, is that okay for the recording purposes?
That's perfect, Annelie, that's no problem.
All right, but obviously I hope my screen share is still going to work. I think it's still working.
Yeah, perfect, it's working perfectly.
All right, so for those not familiar with the South African context, perhaps, or exactly how the Fourth Industrial Revolution sort of features on the South African political agenda, in his 2019 State of the Nation address, Cyril Ramaphosa announced the appointment of a presidential commission on the Fourth Industrial Revolution. And he argued that to ensure that we effectively and with greater urgency harness technological change in pursuit of inclusive growth and social development, we need to align South Africa's development goals with the international understanding of this Fourth Industrial Revolution. He continued to admonish that unless we adapt, unless we understand the nature of the profound change that is reshaping our world, and unless we readily embrace these opportunities, the promise of our nation's birth will forever remain unfulfilled. As a rhetorician, these are, of course, very powerful rhetorical statements. I've placed some of those words in bold. The urgency, the need to adapt and embrace, the threat that perhaps if we didn't embrace these opportunities that we will remain behind. These are all, of course, highly rhetorical statements, and this is what interested me in this project. So Ramaphosa's statements, of course, reflect then the international discourse on Industry 4.0 and the Fourth Industrial Revolution, as was popularized by Klaus Schwab of the World Economic Forum. That's his book there on the right. Schwab said that we are at the beginning of a revolution that is fundamentally changing the way we live, work, and relate to one another. In its scale, scope, and complexity, it is unlike anything humankind has experienced before. Again, very powerful rhetorical statements that are interesting to consider. So while this 4IR movement has become incredibly widespread and popular globally, it has not gone uncriticized. And I've been quite interested in the kinds of critiques that have been directed at the 4IR as a rhetorical construct. And then also, I've been particularly interested in critiques that look at the 4IR as a myth. So I've just included some quotes here by various critics that I've looked at in the last few months. I'll just read a few of them. Sabine Pfeiffer speaks about the Industry 4.0. She speaks more from a German perspective, where Industry 4.0 is the preferred term. They're not entirely synonymous, but they're very much linked. She speaks about it being a media hype, loud buzz, and a myth. Christian Fuchs speaks about Industry 4.0 being an attempt to talk a new technological paradigm ideologically into existence. Uli Meyer speaks about how it's a successfully institutionalized, envisioned future. James Avis says it's the socio-technical imaginary. He draws on the work of Sheila Jasanoff, which is very interesting. In a Korean context, Choi and-jeon speaks about it being a political slogan that has been wielded. Hirsch Kreinzen says it's a masterly example of PR without equal. Madsen looks at it from a management perspective and says it's the latest in a long line of fashionable management concepts. South African critic Alison Gilwald says that it's the mantra of every new policy initiative and official event, while Geldenhuys is perhaps the most cynical of the lot, and he says it's a lot of hooey designed to sell conference tickets. So from this perspective, it's clear that not everyone sees the 4IR as a legitimate and as a relevant concept to be paying that much attention to. So this is why I feel a rhetorical perspective on the 4IR is important. This exceptional amount of hype has raised suspicions about the ulterior motives of the 4IR. For instance, some critics see the vision as serving elite and neoliberal or technocratic interests at the expense of developing more democratic and sustainable policies. So of course, in a South African context, we need to take those kinds of criticisms seriously. A lot of critics are concerned that dominant 4IR rhetorics can naturalize a limited techno-industrial vision and thereby foreclose alternative futures, so to speak. So it presents a very particular kind of reality, and it perhaps neglects other ways of looking at socio-technical development. So it is worth to highlight that these critics don't deny the significance of the increasingly sophisticated and ubiquitous network technologies that are expected to bring about this great socio-technical change. So all of the technologies that Samuel spoke about previously, these are not inconsequential. The question here is that we need to see whether the 4IR as a concept, as a construct, is serviceable, whether rhetorically speaking, it does what we need it to do, whether it allows us to think about socio-technical change and then allow us to pay attention to the right kinds of things. So what the 4IR then as a rhetorical construct does, it takes a cluster of technological phenomena and it reifies it as a thing worth paying attention to. And in Jasanoff's terms, we can consider it a socio-technical imaginary. That doesn't mean that it's not consequential once again, but it does mean that it's not an objective reality, but very much an interpretation that is socially constructed. So to say that I'm taking a rhetorical perspective on the 4IR doesn't mean that I am necessarily suggesting that we get rid of the concept or that we sort of banish it from our vocabulary. because there is a lot of unifying and motivating potential in a powerful socio-technical imaginary like the 4IR. But at the same time, we need to also consider how perhaps there are limiting potentials in the way that we speak about technological development. So in my postdoctoral research project then, I look at these rhetorical aspects of the fourth industrial revolution, how the concept is conceptualized, how it is communicated, and I'm also interested then in how it is visually packaged, because obviously that supports our notions of what this industrial revolution is supposed to be. So I argue that the fourth industrial revolution should not be understood only in technological terms, but as a linguistic and a socio-cultural or a rhetorically constituted phenomenon. While I have my own reservations about whether the 4IR concept really is that serviceable, we do need to take it very seriously for exactly these reasons that I've outlined before, especially if we are going to take on these sustainable development goals as part of design curricula as well. We need to think about how we talk about the 4IR allows us to think in certain ways, and then also design responses to those challenges that we are perceiving. So before I go into the various sort of persuasive aspects of 4IR discourse, I just want to say a few things about the various critiques directed. Actually, I want to just say something about a rhetorical constitution, what I actually mean by that concept. And I'm referring a bit to rhetorical theory here. There are two ways in which one could investigate the 4IR from a rhetorical perspective. And these two approaches reflect perennial debates in rhetorical studies about the nature and the role of rhetorical practice sort of more generally. So the first approach sees rhetorical practice as a response to a socio-technical situation or a socio-cultural situation, if you're speaking about it more broadly, but in the case of the 4IR, we're speaking about a socio-technical situation specifically. This first approach, which is sometimes referred to as the situational theory, treats rhetorical utterances as responses to objective situational demands. It was popularized by Lloyd Bitzer, who emphasized the rhetorical exigency or the situational demands that provide the impetus for a persuasive piece of argumentation. From the situational perspective, the rapidly transforming technological milieu can be considered the exigence for the development of persuasive 4IR arguments. So prominent advocates like Schwab or Ramaphosa or Marwala from UJ, they present themselves as interpreters of a particular socio-technical situation that warrants urgent attention. And most of the mainstream 4IR discourse is, of course, presented from this position, that there is this rhetorical exigency, there is this demand that needs to be met by argumentation. There is, however, a different way of looking at this, and this is the way that I am more interested in, and that is the rhetorical constitution of the socio-technical situation. This approach is supported by social constructionist theorists such as Kenneth Burke, Carolyn Miller, and Watts. And here the situation itself is treated as interpreted and as a rhetorical construct. So I've got some quotes here to help explain what I mean. According to Watts, rhetorical study and or persuasion encompass necessarily the depiction of reality to chosen audiences through chosen media. In all of its forms, such representation involves the rhetoric's choice or choices in trying to determine what should have the attention of chosen audiences and what the chosen situation should mean to those audiences. In short, these discrete situations are largely mythical concepts that are rhetorically based and circumscribed. So from this perspective, the 4IR is perceived as a discrete situation, but only because it is given salience and meaning through very effective rhetorical practice. As Watts argues, situations do not produce rhetoric, but rather rhetoric strategically promotes saliences and meanings for chosen audiences. And when successful, these pass for real situations to which it seems we must pay attention. So it is, of course, my argument that this is exactly what is happening with the way we perceive the fourth industrial revolution. Similarly, Carolyn Miller speaks about how situations are social constructs. that are a result not of perception but of definition. Because human action is based on and guided by meaning, not by material causes, at the center of action is a process of interpretation. Before we can act, we must interpret the indeterminate material environment. We define or determine the situation. So what Miller really tries to highlight here is that a socially constructed rhetorical exigence, such as the 4IR, provides opportunities then for rhetors to further particular individual or group interests within a framework that is socially accepted as a broadly accepted social purpose. And it's possible then for various people to align themselves with this broadly accepted social purpose, but that alignment can be perceived either as genuine or as opportunistic. So, for instance, if supporters of Ramaphosa agree with his 4IR statements, they would see his rhetoric as aligned with the situational demands and therefore as appropriate. Skeptics of Ramaphosa's 4IR agenda would instead maybe see it as an opportunistic attempt to jump onto a bandwagon merely to further political interests, perhaps. So while there is nothing problematic per se about trying to align one's interests with powerfully persuasive rhetorical exigences, these alignments can be exploited for self-serving purposes. And this is, of course, exactly what gives rhetoric its bad reputation, because we associate it with that kind of opportunism. What is most important for me that we recognize, however, is that this 4IR situation is not objectively observed, but that it is rhetorically determined. And this allows us to assess whether it is serviceable, whether it, like I said previously, does what we need it to do. As part of this critical assessment, I think the notion of a deterministic screen as conceptualized by Kenneth Burke is really useful. He spoke about a deterministic screen as the way in which our language directs attention towards something, but also consequently away from something else. He explains how any given terminology is a reflection of reality, but by its very nature as a terminology, it must be a selection, and therefore, to this extent, it must function also as a deflection of reality. It is quite simply just a fact of life that we cannot say anything without directing attention to one field rather than another. It is impossible to talk about everything at once. But for Burke, it is important that we understand that this necessary function of filtering reality is limiting and flawed, and it can be harmful insofar as it's also a way of not seeing. It allows us to see certain things, but it also then detracts our attention away from other things. So the major problem with the deterministic screen, and the main reason why we would need to identify deterministic screens in the first place, is that they do not present themselves as screens, but rather as unmediated realities. So from this perspective, it's important that we recognize the 4IR as a deterministic screen. And that would allow us then to ask what is being reflected in this discourse, but also what is being deflected or what is being neglected. So for the rest of the presentation, I'm going to discuss various points of critique then, and many of these critiques do point out how certain kinds of discourses do deflect attention away from other important issues. So many of the critiques that I look at are international critics, but many of them are also then South African critics who have recently written about the 4IR as a national agenda. But first, before I go into these critiques, I think it's useful to just distinguish between different kinds of criticism directed at the 4IR. The first can be described as an anti-4IR sentiment, where the 4IR is acknowledged as a potential reality or a potential future, and technologies and technological developments are treated as a threat. So from this perspective, the idea is that we need to be very careful of technology. We need to perhaps slow it down or even halt certain kinds of progress. But this kind of sentiment does reinforce the overarching 4IR logic that I will speak more about in a minute. The second kind of criticism, which I find more interesting, calls the entire 4IR concept into question. Critics in this space perceive the 4IR concept as a strategically persuasive construct that serves political purposes. So this kind of criticism takes aim at the mystifying effects then of 4IR discourse, And the aim is to discredit the 4IR as an irrational or dogmatically accepted illusion that is really furthered through mystifying tactics. So while not all these critics refer to the 4IR as rhetorical, they aim to delegitimize the concept by drawing attention to the discursive constitution and the persuasive strategies used throughout the discourse. All right. So this is important from a critical perspective because critics such as Poole explain how there is an implicit politics, for instance, in Schwab's book, in the vocabulary that warrants interrogation. And these critiques are commonly associated then with, like I said previously, the reinforcement of neoliberal ideologies or elite and technocratic kinds of approaches to development. So the first line of critique relates to how the 4IR is perceived as not really revolutionary, or that the revolutionary claims are actually unfounded. So according to Leonard Gentle, much of the readiness to uncritically embrace the notion of the fourth industrial revolution is based on a shoddy understanding of human history. And there's a number of other theorists who argue the same, that we shouldn't see the fourth industrial revolution as a fourth in a series of revolutions. Many, for instance, believe that the changes we are seeing currently are better characterized as evolutionary or as an extension of existing technologies rather than as ruptures of a trajectory. This is, of course, a semantics issue, whether the 4IR really does qualify as a revolution at all. But to many, the fact that the 4IR seems like more of an intensification of the status quo, the term revolution is considered false and empty. So further criticism is then also directed at this prophetic nature of the discourse, where people like Christian Fuchs says we need to be very skeptical of claims that revolutions will inevitably take place soon. Previous revolutions, well, the first and the second revolutions were conceptualized long after they occurred, and the impacts were highly visible in retrospect. On the other hand, the so-called third and fourth revolutions, industrial revolutions, replaces what was seen as a retrospective review of the sum total of social changes over the past with a prescription for the present. He sees this as the stuff of politicians, soothsayers and consultants seeking to be ahead of the game, where people say we'd better embrace the 4.0 or we will fall behind. From a German perspective, Sabine Pfeiffer says something similar. She speaks about Industry 4.0 not causally resulting from society having reached a new stage of technological development. She sees it as first and foremost the result of a professionally managed agenda setting. From the perspective of discourse analysis, this is a clear case of successful public relations. And then we get similar commentaries from South Africans as well, like Castro and Duncan that I've referenced there. For instance, Michael Gastro says that the 4IR concept is not embedded in a body of disciplinary research. It can be read as an ideological statement of the World Economic Forum and a loosely structured rhetorical argument. From this critical perspective, arguments are inflated. The revolutionary rhetoric is considered unfounded and inflated, but of course, these statements are very persuasive. They're highly effective rhetorical arguments, as Jane Duncan then highlights. Schwab invents this fourth industrial revolution because it enhances his argument by claiming that this revolution is unprecedented and consequently it should receive urgent attention from policymakers. This is, of course, a very cynical view, and I apologize to anyone who sees the 4IR entirely differently, but I think it's an interesting perspective nonetheless. In other words, this notion of revolution is, from a rhetorical perspective, highly effective at creating salience and grabbing attention. From a critical perspective, these kinds of unfounded or inflated revolutionary claims are important to consider because someone like Broadbent, for instance, argues that it is imprudent to build a future based on a fiction, even a science fiction. We cannot design curricula to teach inaccurate sound bites. Most importantly, if we're to teach critical thinking, we must imbue the entire 4IR ethos with that approach. So in principle, someone like Broadbent feels like characterizing the current or the imminent state of technology as an actual revolution when it doesn't really fit that description, he sees that as in principle problematic. So then there's a bunch of other claims or critiques directed at 4IR rhetorics. For instance, that the language used is technologically determinist and therefore quite anti-revolutionary. The 4IR is presented as inevitable and that we must simply embrace it or adapt to whatever it is that is happening. Boskin and Charlin, South African critics, they share international critics' disapproval of these kinds of terminologies, like having to adapt to this technology around us. Poole says the idea that we must all adapt is seldom challenged, but it is really a veiled update of social Darwinism, according to which the people who survive the coming robot deluge will, by definition, have been the fittest all along. So that's a controversial statement, I think, but it is nonetheless something worth considering. I think I skipped a slide there, sorry. From a South African perspective, William Shoki says something quite similar. He says that getting too swept up in the fourth industrial revolution buzz means surrendering to technical rationality, the consequence being that capital is well placed to manufacture consent for the new world that comes under the guise of it's just the way things are. And further, that technological change is rationalized as purely a natural and inevitable process for which individuals must adapt or die as an obfuscation of the role of capital, the agents precipitating these shifts, tectonic or otherwise. So this relates back again, of course, to this idea of deterministic screens that deflect attention away from where these changes are coming from. Here's just a few more quotes. The call to adapt indeed implies that the changing circumstances Schwab foresees are something like inexorable forces of nature, but of course they aren't. They will be the results of decisions taken by legislators, regulators, and others in power. He suggests that an alternative idea would be for citizens to engage in and if necessary, challenge such decisions rather than meekly adapt to whatever their masters decide the world should be like. That would really be democracy in action and might even deserve the name of revolution. So from these critical perspectives, the fourth industrial revolution, the way that it is presented to us, the kinds of language that is being used and how it is presented to us, doesn't really warrant the name of a revolution because it is imposed from above. Like Boskin and Charlin says, it's the first revolutionary call coming from the ruling class, high up in the Alps. Fortune 500 CEOs, state leaders, royalty, celebrities assured each other that they were living in extraordinary times. So essentially, the argument here is that the language used to promote the 4IR doesn't put a lot of agency in the hands of individual people because they're told to adapt or fall behind. Another point of critique relates to how 4IR discourse comes across merely as sort of generic techno-rhetoric. And there are a number of issues that I think are worth exploring here, or reasons for why the language of 4IR can come across as super generic and merely rhetorical. The first is that the revolutionary label of the 4IR could perhaps be considered an application of what Burke refers to as a God term. God terms like freedom or liberty can make arguments automatically legitimate and compelling. Other powerful God terms like innovation or disruption also feature really powerfully in 4IR discourse. From this perspective, the issue is not that the 4IR is a rhetorical construct, but that it co-opts powerful rhetorical God terms that are, for many people, quite empty of meaning because of the way that they've been used and overused. So people like Alex Broadbent again would say that the 4IR narrative says almost nothing at all. It just seems so empty. This relates then also to how critics perceive 4IR discourse as very generic and vague. The discourse contains a high level of generalization, and this allows for a wide applicability and an interpretive flexibility, because we're talking about so many different technologies and so many different industries. You're almost talking about anything, which makes it seem like you're almost talking about nothing. So the discourse is sufficiently vague and open-ended to allow this concept to be applied in different contexts and for different purposes. And this is exactly what makes it spread and what makes it stable as a really popular trend. But of course, then this is also what makes the 4IR come across as a rhetorically empty or like a bullshit concept, because it is written in what Poole describes as a high management style that contains fashionable vacuity and as a heavy dose of tech utopian boilerplate. So if we are going to work towards appropriate technologies, and we are going to talk about the fourth industrial revolution, we need to be very mindful that these kinds of discourses does raise skepticism because of this kind of language that comes across as vague and generic and not very specific at all. The last point of critique that I really want to get into detail is what is referred to as this ambivalent promise promoted through 4IR discourse, where there's a really potent mixture of utopian and dystopian language, such as, for instance, when Schwab says, from the perspective of human history, there has never been a time of greater promise or potential peril. Stephen Poole looks at how Schwab juxtaposes these pros and cons of technologies in a way, and presents himself as even-handed about the upsides and downsides of every technology he discusses. Artificial intelligence might be super useful, or it might constitute an existential threat to humanity. Biotechnology might cure all diseases, or it might create a chasm of bioinequality. The overall problem is that this is basically all Schwab does, describing some future development or its opposite, and essentially asking, is it brilliant or is it terrible? So, I mean, this is again, perhaps a controversial statement that you may agree or disagree with, whether you think Schwab is being hyperbolic or super ambivalent. But I think it's important to consider how this style of speaking is incredibly persuasive. It creates a technological tour de force through the discourse, as Sabina Pfeiffer describes it. But it also presents people as very measured or balanced in a kind of technological realism. So by presenting these opportunities and threats next to each other, you can present yourself as a realist, so to speak. You're not a Luddite, and you're not a technological optimist, but a realist instead. But what it also does then from a rhetorical perspective is by presenting these opportunities and threats in such a juxtaposed manner, along with this great uncertainty of we don't know which way it's going to go, it of course creates great urgency. And this is, of course, an important aspect of what makes 4IR rhetoric so persuasive. Not sure how I'm doing for time, Angus. Should I be wrapping up?
It's about 3:15 now, so maybe if, 2 or 3 more minutes. Yeah. All
right. I'll just say a couple of things about the dynamics of fourth industrial revolution sort of propagation. A lot of the criticism around how the 4IR is spoken about relates to this idea that it has become so popular. It's almost as if the fact that it is popular makes people skeptical. And this is, of course, not uncommon for cultural critics to do. But a few critics then look more deeply into the mechanisms that have enabled this concept to spread almost virally. These underlying mechanisms are then treated also with suspicion, because they almost foster an uncritical adoption of this concept. This is done through a high-profile network of managers, politicians, other influential figures, employers and business organizations, trade unions. Everyone is promoting this vision, which makes it diffuse and stabilize, and then it becomes institutionalized, like it very much has in various South African institutions. This then becomes sort of a circular or self-reinforcing process, which is because it becomes a part of sense making in organizations. It helps people make sense of the current situation. And then it triggers dynamics very similar to self-fulfilling prophecies. But otherwise, when this vision really becomes successful, it doesn't require any further justification. If the imagined future has made it, then it is used to justify other propositions, which again refers back to that idea of a God term status. We don't question it any longer because it's moved from a mere possibility to almost a requirement. Everyone has to buy into it. Other critics like Matson, for that reason, explore the 4IR as an instant of what she calls management fashion, and she compares it to other hype cycles found in management industries. And these critics are then also very critical of specialized organizations. Samuel spoke about the Presidential Commission on the 4IR, which is such a specialized organization whose existence depends on and is dedicated to the success of this envisioned future. And therefore, they are very committed actors who strive to ensure its diffusion and stabilization. So critics are of course skeptical of these kinds of organizations because their success and their existence is tied up in the success of this envisioned future. So perhaps in closing, I'll just show a couple of cartoons that were published in South Africa to illustrate how this rhetoric of the 4IR is treated with some skepticism. Here you can see Cyril Ramaphosa delivering his sona saying, "Welcome to South Africa's fourth industrial revolution." And of course, this took place amidst our national energy crisis, and skeptics were, of course, saying, how are we supposed to focus our attention on advanced network technologies if we don't have a stable electricity supply? And there's number of other South African critiques then that are particular to South Africa. From a rhetorical perspective, some South African critics feel like adopting the term 4IR, which of course originated in the World Economic Forum, they see this as a problematic move, as it is seen as just an uncritical adoption of a Eurocentric position. Others like Kotze suggest that we need to develop more authentic local narratives, and that this will enable us to mobilize people in a better and more effective way, instead of relying on Eurocentric ideas to try and promote certain kinds of development agendas. Other South African critics see the 4IR as a malign distraction because it distracts South Africans from redressing inequality and looking at inclusive digital economy and society. Leonard Gentle in particular is very critical of the 4IR's focus on advanced technologies, because from his perspective as a public health researcher, most of South Africa's really pressing problems can be solved through sort of low-tech means, and that high-tech solutionism sort of detracts attention away from those other policy decisions and implementations that need to happen. So again, these critics basically see the 4IR as a deterministic screen that deflects attention, perhaps even more than it reflects the South African realities. This high-tech solutionism as an easy fix is then also treated with skepticism in South Africa. And Jane Duncan explains this by saying that the 4IR offers attractive ideas for those who do not want to confront the complex systemic nature of South Africa's development problems, but want to appear revolutionary. These ideas allow government and the ruling party to talk the revolution talk without walking the revolution walk. They assign to technology the ability to solve social problems, which gets the ANC and government off the hook and having to have a proper discussion about what it's really what it'll really take to pull South Africa out of the morass. So yeah, this is my last slide, and I think it offers a good summary of these kinds of criticisms. Here you can see, this is a cartoon by Carlos Amato for the new frame, and here you can see school children looking at a crowd, sort of like a worshipping crowd with these very abstract concepts, big data, blockchain, and AI floating above this crowd, asking what are they doing, and they're waiting for the fourth industrial revolution. Well, in the next frame, you see this reality, the South African reality of a pit toilet, which is not something that is a high-tech problem. This is something that the first or the second industrial revolutions were supposed to address already. So it speaks to this idea of deflection and deterministic screens about appropriate priorities within the South African context. So yes, just to reiterate, my research project considers the fourth industrial revolution not just from a technological perspective, but as a rhetorical construct. But to be clear, I do not aim to discredit the significance of technological change, but rather to supplement perspectives by shedding light on the persuasive nature and the strategic usage of this 4IR concept. I do not wish to debunk the concept as merely rhetorical in a pejorative sense, but rather I wish to highlight how rhetorical practices impact how we frame socio-technical change, and this then in turn impacts our development priorities and policies. Yeah, thanks. I think I'll end there.
Great. Thank you so much, Annelie. That was really a fascinating presentation. Yeah, very interesting, sort of following on from Samuel and what he presented. I think what we'll do is we'll go into a session of sort of question and answers. And if anybody has something that they would like to ask, please either just send it through as a message or just, I think you can raise your hand through the participant list. And I think if sort of Annelie and Samuel could unmute yourselves so that you're able to respond. I think for me, maybe I'll begin, in terms of the discussion itself. I think both these presentations were quite different, but there's some really interesting alignments between the two of them. I think in some ways, Samuel's really looking at the kind of practicalities of being able to teach design, and I suppose what are now these policy expectations in terms of sort of technological change and keeping up with the Joneses in a sense in terms of these sort of 4IR agendas. And then, Annelie, you presented a fascinating sort of critique of the concept itself. And what I find really interesting, and I mean this is something that our VC presented in one of his sessions around 4IR, is that he talked about the fact that Africa, sort of as a colonized space, was left out of many of the industrial revolutions before. And so for him, this is why it's such an important agenda, especially in the University of Johannesburg, to not lose out on that. And it's an interesting one because it is in many ways, the way that you've described it, Annelie, is talking about, it's almost propaganda. But that propaganda in itself is got an economic agenda behind it, and that economic agenda is there to put money behind things. It's almost like some kind of form of like kind of disaster capitalism. It's like if you don't actually keep up with this, you're going to fall behind. And I mean, it's had that response. I mean, especially since it's come out of the sort of World Economic Forum. It's about, this is where we're going and this is where we're at, and let's put lots of money behind this. And then I think that, a lot of the responses that have come out of South Africa is, well, look, if we don't do this, and if we don't, then are we going to be left behind? Are we going to miss out again in terms of sort of opportunities, for for economic benefit, for the continent itself. So we start to like, I almost, it's like a bit of an echo of the, it's President Truman, at the end of the Second World War, when he, talked about this idea of the developed world and the undeveloped world, and, the developed world needs to use its technology to help those in the undeveloped world, which is really just another form of imperialism, but now through the use of technology. So, the idea of appropriate technology that Samuel was talking about is I think, really important. And also, I think there's an interesting irony in all of this, is that both of you are postdocs, exploring this through funding that has been made available because, of 4IR. So it's a very convoluted discussion, but very interesting nonetheless. So, I mean, yeah, I'm just kind of putting that out there, in a way that, this definitely has an agenda around it. And that agenda is to, I think it's very much economic. And it feels like a sort of a very imperialistic agenda, particularly since, a lot of the so-called 4IR technologies are coming outside of the continent. And so in some ways, I really understand, the University of Johannesburg's response. But I also understand, your response, Annelie, and the fact that it's, what is this thing? Is it actually something that's real, or is it just, is it just a really good poster that's been put together to get us to buy into this concept? So I don't know if either of you have any sort of response to that comment.
I'll just quickly say something. I'm not particularly critical of the 4IR in the sense that I think it's unserviceable. I think it can serve all of those purposes that UJ's Vice Chancellor thinks it can, to mobilize people in a sort of unified way against, to get them to all buy into a certain agenda and get them to work together, because it is so persuasive. There is something incredibly persuasive about this kind of discourse. And I don't think we should dismiss that. But at the same time, because there is a lot of skepticism in the public media that I've seen about the 4IR, I think those are the kinds of criticisms that we also need to be aware of when we are designing programs that we want to be effective, because maybe a different label would have been better. Maybe a different way of talking about it would be better. I'm not entirely sure whether that's true, but I think these are important questions to consider.
Yeah, I think that the fact that the world is more global than it was like 100, 200 years ago actually also plays, has a way of us rethinking about our approach to technological progress. So, of course, Africa as it is, the first industrial revolution became, it feeds on Africa's resources as it is, and of course, but the world as we have it today has become so fused together that the student that we are training might become a workforce for another country. So, and of course, for design education, whether we like it or yes, this technology has been a tool for design. And of course, right from the time where people have to draw using manual, on what do you call it, like a drawing board and all of that. And now we have CAD tools and all of that. But, all of these things, new technologies coming now are being adopted to, of course, advanced design, innovation, and all of that. So I think it's for design education, if this can be properly situated, it can make a whole lot of how do I put it, irrespective of the political agenda that might be behind this. Of course, I also do ask myself, why do we have to call it fourth industrial revolution? For instance, I cited the case of Japan. Japan called its progress Society 5.0. And if we look at the context of the Japanese, it's an aging society, and there are actually imminent problems that are before them. And of course, in the agenda, they are trying to see how they can solve the societal problem. And that's why they advance that agenda. So of course, for South Africa, well, the framing, I like the way you've really challenged. I mean, Aneli, I like the way you've challenged the framing. It makes us to really rethink, is this actually what we need to make our society more inclusive? Because of course, technology can make a society more divided than more inclusive. I mean, of course, like in the case of the internet, for instance, when we look at the internet access index, South Africa is still quite very low, of course, still doing better, of course, compared to other African countries. But I mean, there are still quite a lot of things we've not gotten right, and governance is still there and all of that. But we hope that with this agenda, if for institution, and if the institution can actually be the referee, you know, the umpire, someone to actually put things in check, this is what the politicians are saying. Of course, this is what we think the students should prepare for, the future they should prepare for. I think it would help us to actually have a proper outlook, and of course, shaping our curriculum in a way that will benefit all. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for that response, Samuel. Suan, please forgive me if I'm pronouncing your name incorrectly. Suan, you've got a question that you would like to ask the presenters?
Hello.
Hi. Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Thanks for I can join with this good opportunity. I'm from Korea. Hello.
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes. I cannot hear my voice.
Okay.
I'm from Korea, and currently I'm studying on my master program. So actually, I'm writing on my thesis, and Dr. Samuel Adelabu, during his presentation, it is a little bit similar like in my thesis some part. So my thesis is like can I introduce something and then can I asking some?
Of course. Go ahead.
Right now, based on 4IR and through the network, I need to try some human and nature communication. So the communication treatment for currently our big issue, climate change mitigation. So that can control remotely purification. So this is, as I'm Korean, actually right now, because of COVID-19 also, and also the air condition is not really good because of some microdust. This is Korea case of like Korea case, but I'm so interested about this South Africa case. For example, South Africa is, I can say the nature of things is better condition than Korea. So I think I need to asking here even if they have a good design, for IR, but if they couldn't understand some of the people, how they can participate on this design work. So my meaning is on educator and educator, how can lead to this 4IR design system?
Okay, let me, yeah, Samuel, I don't know if you understood the question there. I mean, I think, you know, so in terms of your framing, I mean, I think many of the sort of environmental problems, that you're talking about, we face, in South Africa as well. And I think that, many, and this is, something that's, I think is quite important to think about in terms of 4IR, is that, a lot of the sort of the environmental aspects of 4IR kind of technologies is very hidden. It's out of the, it's out of it's out of your perspective. So, cloud computing, all these sorts of things, which are, amazing sort of technologies, somewhere those computers are physically hosted. And, a lot of the AI technologies require massive amounts of energy to run. So, I mean, I think there's a very interesting contestation between the sort of limits, planetary limits that we have, and there's sort of, again, this kind of almost like this indeterminate technological Garden of Eden that 4IR is presented as. But I know that you were directing your question to Samuel, so maybe Samuel can unpack a response a bit further.
Yeah, thanks, Park, for joining us. And I've been in Korea, I think once like that, so I can really, and I was in Japan for some time, so yeah, thanks for joining us. And yeah, I think we can still connect after this program, I mean, after this seminar, to perhaps really take time to iron out, because of course, if I feel that I get your question very well, my response may not be very appropriate. So I will drop you my email, and then I can send you a paper that we just published recently as part of a presentation that we made in a conference last week. So definitely you understand our approach to framing the curricular requirement for the 4IR era. So, but what I would say, of course, I know that South Korea is also a technological advanced society, and of course they take pride in technological progress. And for design education, like we know, design education design as it is, has promoted the product of the first industrial revolution, or right from the first industrial revolution, design has been promoting production, so I would say also design has promoted consumerism. So, but we're in a time where we're beginning to question all of this, what we produce, what we consume, and all of that. So, and it's going to give a kind of onus for the teachers or for the educators to actually think about their approach to teaching designs, especially things that would have to border on the impact of the designs that we make, the impact of the product that we make. And do we actually need more? Do we need to redesign? There are a lot of questions we need to ask ourselves. So, and we know that design is also, it has a business dimension. So we need to kind of create a balance, which is one approach that we took for our study, that there has to be a systemic balance, between the social factors, the economic factors, and the environmental factors. There has to be a consideration in the curriculum for all of this, and so that we can actually situate design education within the sustainability framework. And of course, we still agree on that as globally, that of course we want to achieve a sustainable future. We want to promote a sustainable future. And I believe that, of course, if our design, our curricular framing can also take into account all of these. And of course, it's much more complex than the problems that we're facing today are much more complex. The systems are much more complex or complicated. So the need to also give the student the right skills matters. There are a set of skills they refer to as the human skills, the interpersonal skills, the intrapersonal skills. Of course, the cognitive skills are important, but we're beginning to also see why the sense for citizenship is also important for design education, where designers will also can have a voice you know, their design can also question, you know, their design can also, you know, challenge all these, you know, how do I put it, wasteful trend that we experience today. So I think, yeah, I mean, for Korea, of course, Korea is an advanced country, very industrialized, but I believe as a researcher, of course, I hope you'll be able to take a proper positioning, of course, to of course, to have, you know, to be able to critically engage this issue with the society. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Annelie, I don't know if you want to respond. I see we've got another question that's going to be asked.
I think we can go to the next question. I don't know if I have something
perfect.
to add to the previous discussion.
Right, perfect. Yeah. Amira, I see that your hand's raised. Would you like to ask a question?
Yes, thank you so much, Angus, and thanks to the presenters. I really appreciated your talks. I don't really have questions. I'm just going to share some reflections because, I mean, at university, we have had to write reports, as an example, showing how we're aligning what we teach with the fourth industrial revolution. And I've always been very uncomfortable with it, but I admit I haven't, I'm comfortable and suspicious of it, and I haven't sat down and carefully thought about it. And that's why I appreciated these talks, because at least it kind of allows me to start reflecting at a deeper level about it. It seems like there's like greater academic buy-in into the concept, and also, you know, great buy-in from the politicians, as has become evident in what the speakers shared. And sorry, I forget the name, the lady spoke about how convincing this concept has been. And it just made me think about whose voices are heard and which voices are not heard. And I believe that we as academics and professionals are never immune to being seduced by some concepts. And especially for me as an architect and in the architectural profession, we really are, you know, we're very good at creating hype around certain people and certain ideas. And we don't easily admit it, but we're easily seduced. And I think one of the reasons why I've been so uncomfortable with this is that I feel that there's a lot of seduction around it. So, you know, please forgive me because I haven't thought deeply enough, but for me, why I appreciated the talk is it's almost like an invitation to think deeper about it, and I really appreciate that. In design disciplines and in architecture, a lot of times if you present something different to the hype that's out there, you get excluded and sidelined, and you're constantly on the periphery. Yes, and that's, I think that's why this very wide scale buy-in of this concept bothers me. There's always like a pressure to adopt a term or an approach or a concept and the people that promote them. And I've sometimes attended talks and read texts where I felt like I'm almost being hypnotized, you know, without any real depth. And certain ideas and certain people are put on pedestals. And recently I came across an article called Low-Tech Dumb Cities, which really appealed to me. So I just thought I'd share these reflections. I hope they're useful just as some ideas, but I'm just saying thank you for allowing me to think deeper about this. So it's not a real question, but I'm just sharing my what I felt about the presentations. Thank you so much. Thank you, Angus.
Thank you so much, Amira. I don't know if either of you want to respond to Amira's comments at all.
I'll say something briefly. Thanks, Amira. I'm so glad that something I said resonated with you, because I am presenting a slightly different angle on the topic. I just want to say a few things about seduction, like you said. I think I think there's nothing wrong with seduction per se, other than the fact that it can cause us to adopt things unreflectively. So, so I think if it's a seductive concept, but for the right reasons, then there's no reason to reject it. But I do think that in many ways, the 4IR concept has been treated a little bit superficially, and that for that reason, some academics like us find it problematic. All of these technologies, though, are super important, like everything that Samuel was talking about in terms of the design curriculum, and I think the same goes for architecture. These technologies are incredibly important to pay attention to. I have my reservations about whether framing all of these technologies under this banner is actually useful. It might be more useful to speak about particularities and specificities rather than speaking about these technological developments in such generic and generalized terms. That is my 2 cents worth.
Thanks for that, Annelie. Are there any other questions or comments from anybody else in the audience that you would like to make for the 2 speakers? Great. Well, thanks. Leora, would you like to make a comment? No? Hi. I think, I think it's been a fascinating discussion. I think there's some very, for me, as a designer, really thinking deeply about this concept is really wonderful. And, from a very critical point of view. I mean, I think, the faculty has taken a relatively critical stance on this idea of 4IR. And I think, actually presented a counter argument around Society 4.0, to, I suppose, align with the sexiness of the 4.0 part, but to actually really bringing this back down to people. And I think it's really interesting to, I mean, ultimately this is all about some, form of mediation, the mediation of technology and the extension of human capabilities into the world. And I really liked your positioning, Annelie, where you were talking about, well, actually all of the revolutions in itself have just been some kind of, I suppose, like evolution of technology itself, and everything kind of, I suppose, builds on what comes before. And there's some very interesting philosophers of technology that say that you actually, there's no such thing as radical innovation. There's no such thing as innovation, actually, because innovation always claims this idea of newness. That actually in all technology, it's built on pre-existing technologies. The internet's made up of little bits and pieces inside it, inside the computers that actually operate it, that are, transistors, etc., that are very, relatively basic forms of technology that enabled us to get to the point of much more complex, systemic technological reality. But anyway, these are fascinating things. These are things that I'm very interested in myself, and thank you both for your very considered papers, and it's really awesome having you both in our faculty as postdocs. Leora, do you want to make a comment? I see.
Sorry, I'm just coming in right at the end with a really obtuse kind of question. Firstly, I wanted to say thank you very much to the speakers and to you, Angus, for organizing what I think has been an amazing seminar and a really, really good discussion. I think more of which we need, basically. There tends to be this kind of wholesale acceptance of 4IR, particularly within the sciences. And yeah, I think within the humanities and the arts, we have a strong obligation to actually question 4IR quite critically for its positives, but also for things that we should really be taking account of. I suppose my question is really, it's a ridiculous one, but there it goes. Where does 4IR leave questions of race and gender and class? And I'm just throwing it out there. I don't even know if anyone needs to answer that one. It's just one that I grapple with a lot. And I suppose the other question is technology gendered? Is is technology predominantly male and patriarchal? And how do we grapple, if so, I mean, how do we determine that? And how do we grapple with it? So I'm probably asking questions that absolutely cannot be answered at this time, and I'm just throwing them out there for contemplation.
I have a small comment on that, if I may. Leora, I think the 4IR discourse is very silent about issues of race and gender and class. And I think that is exactly the problem. It's a deflection once again. And I think it's a deflection that we need to consider very, very seriously. Where are these discourses coming from? They are primarily coming from European nations, primarily white males. And it's in their interest to deflect our attention in certain ways. So I'm taking a very skeptical approach in saying that, but I think it's important, like you said, to consider issues of race and gender and class. Some lip service is being paid to how the 4IR can exacerbate inequality and class differences, but it really comes across as lip service at this stage. I don't think there's really a lot of attention being paid to how technologies need to be implemented to really solve those problems, which is why it's incredibly important that South Africans and other Africans and people in the Global South get into these technologies, really understand them, and teach curricula that are going to meet these demands. But at the same time, I don't think we should adopt certain kinds of discourses just because they're popular.
I would just like to add to that. Thanks, Anneli. Yeah, it's true that the issue of gender and racial discrimination have not been really pronounced, but I think in some of the discourse that were made, especially through the Vice Chancellor, Professor Mawala, we're beginning to see one of the things that is using to encourage, especially people of all races to engage is that sometimes this technology can be developed in such a way that they would discriminate. And I'll give an example. For instance, facial recognition works based on artificial intelligence. And there is a way that this technology can be very selective, like even in terms of voice recognition and all of that. So, there are languages that would need to be, deliberately, worked upon, integrated into the system, built, there has to be algorithm designed for all of this. And so if people from, of course, all races will not get involved or get engaged, then it will be like they are designing for others. There's this book titled Design for the Other 90%. There is also the one titled Design with the Other 90%. So, but I mean, if this is actually going to be a human-centered design, or is a human-centered approach, or like for technological advancement or progress, then of course, I also see the educational institution playing a very crucial role. Of course, like I said, we are like, we are the umpire, we are the referee, we're going to actually keep the society in check, because of course, there are many factors that are at work. There are many things, that is at play. So, but definitely, of course, it's a question I would definitely work on and, do some deliberate search. I think it's also a very thought-provoking question that we can take on. Yeah, thank you.
No, thanks for that, Anneli and Samuel and Leora. I think it's a wonderful question. And I mean, for me, I think, there's a huge entanglement between technology and society and the rest of the world, the rest of the planet. And it's a very complex, entanglement. And I think that it's really important. And again, a lot of the sort of philosophy of technology literature explores ideas of ownership and control and access and use, and also sort of unintended consequences of technology. And I think, in many ways, gender and race, are very core to the ideas of control and who's in power. And so, ultimately, the patriarchal reality that we sort of live in is definitely going to play out in technological determinacy. But yeah, it's a very interesting thing to explore, particularly in the 4IR domain. And I think, Annelie, just in making comment on the, just the references that you included in your own presentation, like most of the people speaking were men. I mean, there were a few, no, most of the people who were saying very positive things about 4IR were men. And most of the critique, a fair amount of critique was coming from both genders. But I think that in itself is quite interesting. Yeah. So I think we've almost reached at the end of our time, and so I just want to say thank you to everybody for participating. Thank you, Samuel and Annelie, for two really wonderful presentations that you put. I can see a lot of effort into. And this will be recorded and be made available. So if people want to kind of, I suppose, nitpick what was presented and find some of your references, because there was some really fascinating information that was provided. And